There is a moment, and every man who has truly lived knows this moment, when the ground beneath him simply disappears. Not cracks, not shifts, disappears. The business collapses overnight. The relationship that defined him dissolves into silence. The reputation he spent a decade constructing gets dismantled in a single conversation. The money runs out, the allies vanish, the phone stops ringing. And in that moment, most men do something that seals their fate permanently. They begin to grieve. They begin to explain. They begin to seek sympathy from anyone willing to listen, replaying the injustice, cataloguing the betrayal, auditing the unfairness of what happened to them. They become historians of their own ruin. And while they are busy documenting the collapse, the world moves forward without them. This is not cruelty. This is simply the nature of power. The world was never waiting for you. It will not pause to mourn with you. And the sooner you understand this, the sooner you can begin to do what powerful people have always done when they lose everything. They rebuild. But not the way most men imagine rebuilding. Not with hope, not with prayers, not with the fragile optimism of someone who believes fortune will eventually be fair. They rebuild the way Niccolò Machiavelli described in the cold, surgical pages of his work, with calculation, with patience, with a willingness to look at reality without flinching, without decoration, without the comfortable lies that destroyed them in the first place. Machiavelli lived this. He was not a man theorizing from comfort. He was a man who had held real power, advisor to the Florentine Republic, a diplomat who negotiated with kings and generals and then had it stripped from him completely. In 1512, the Medici returned to Florence. Machiavelli was removed from his position, accused of conspiracy, imprisoned, tortured. Everything he had built, every relationship, every position, every shred of influence, gone. He was banished to his farm outside the city, forbidden from entering Florence, erased from the political world he had spent his entire life mastering. Most men in that position disappear from history. They become cautionary tales. They die bitter, small, forgotten. Machiavelli wrote The Prince. He took the wreckage of his life and turned it into one of the most powerful documents ever written on the nature of power, strategy, and human behavior. Not because he was lucky, not because fortune returned to him unbidden, but because he understood something that the men who defeated him never grasped, that total loss, when approached correctly, is not the end of power. It is the beginning of a different and far more dangerous kind of power, the kind that cannot be taken by others because it lives entirely within the man himself. This is what we are going to dissect today. The actual mechanics, the psychological architecture, the step-by-step internal process that separates the men who rise from the men who remain buried. Not inspiration, not motivation. Mechanics, because the first thing you must understand, and this will feel uncomfortable if you are still in the middle of your collapse, is that the version of you that existed before the loss was not as strong as you believed. That version had power that was borrowed, influence that was circumstantial, confidence that was conditional. It depended on external structures, the job title, the relationship, the money, the social proof, to hold its shape. And when those structures were removed, the shape collapsed with them. This is not an insult. This is a diagnosis. And powerful people, the ones who rebuild into something unrecognizable, begin with this diagnosis. They do not begin with optimism. They begin with honesty. Brutal, clear-eyed, merciless honesty about exactly how fragile the previous structure was and exactly which weaknesses allowed the collapse to occur. Machiavelli called this the study of necessity. He wrote that men are driven either by ambition or by necessity, and that necessity is the sharper teacher. When you still have comfort, you can afford illusions. You can tell yourself stories about your judgment, your relationships, your place in the world. But when necessity arrives, when you have lost everything and the illusions are no longer sustainable, you are finally forced to see clearly. And that clarity, as painful as it is the first raw material of reconstruction. The powerful man in ruins does not ask, "Why did this happen to me?" He asks, "What exactly was I not seeing before this happened?" He turns the collapse into a forensic investigation. He examines every decision that led to this moment, not to punish himself, but to extract intelligence. Where was he naive? Where did he confuse loyalty with habit? Where did he mistake politeness for alliance? Where did he allow emotion to override observation? Where did he trust what people said instead of watching what they did? Every answer to those questions is a weapon, not a wound, a weapon, because the man who understands precisely how he was defeated holds the blueprint of how to become undefeatable. And this is the second thing powerful people do when they lose everything that most men completely skip over in their desperation to rebuild quickly. They slow down, they go still, they enter what Machiavelli would recognize as the period of observation and recalibration, a phase that looks like inactivity from the outside but is in reality the most intense and consequential work a man can do. The instinct after collapse is to move, to act, to demonstrate to the world and to yourself that you are not finished, that you are still capable, that the loss has not broken you. This instinct is understandable. It is also catastrophic when followed prematurely. Because a man who moves before he has recalibrated carries his old weaknesses into his new efforts. He rebuilds the same structure with the same flaws and invites the same collapse. He mistakes speed for progress. He confuses visible effort with genuine reconstruction. And within a few years, sometimes within a few months, the second collapse arrives, and it is worse than the first, because now it carries the additional weight of repeated failure. Machiavelli watched this pattern destroy men throughout his political career. He watched rulers who lost power scramble to reclaim it through the same methods that lost it for them in the first place, through false alliances, through borrowed force, through the appearance of strength without its actual foundation. And he documented what happened to them with a precision that reads less like political philosophy and more like a clinical autopsy. The men who rebuilt successfully did something different. They accepted a period of apparent smallness. They withdrew. They observed. They studied the landscape that had defeated them with the detached curiosity of a general examining a battlefield after a loss, looking not for someone to blame, but for the tactical reality of what actually happened versus what he had assumed was happening. They separated what was true from what they had wished to be true. And they were ruthless in this separation, because they understood that the comfort of illusion was the luxury of men who could afford to lose again. They could not. This is the phase most motivational content skips entirely, because it is not dramatic. There is no cinematic montage to accompany a man sitting in silence, dissecting his own thinking, rewriting his own assumptions about people and power, and the way the world actually operates. But this is where the real rebuilding happens. Not in the gym, not in the early morning routine, not in the aggressive pursuit of the next opportunity. In the stillness, in the uncomfortable, undecorated confrontation with reality. And what does a man discover in that stillness if he is honest enough to stay in it? He discovers that most of what he called confidence was familiarity. He was confident in environments he had navigated before, with people who had already accepted him, in systems he already understood. Strip away those familiar structures, and the confidence evaporated because it was never really his. It belonged to the circumstances. The man who rebuilds into something powerful takes that observation and uses it to construct something entirely different, a confidence that is not circumstantial but architectural, built on demonstrated capability rather than assumed status, built on knowledge that has been tested rather than reputation that has been inherited. He discovers that most of what he called loyalty in his relationships was actually comfort and convenience. The people who surrounded him were there because it was easy to be there, because there was something to gain, because the association cost them nothing and occasionally benefited them. When the cost of association rose, when standing beside him required sacrifice, when being connected to him carried risk rather than reward, those people performed the quiet disappearing act that collapse always produces. And he must look at this clearly, not with bitterness, but with a cold recognition that he had confused proximity for allegiance, and that this confusion was expensive. Machiavelli was unsparing on this point. He wrote that men will betray you for small advantages and abandon you when protection costs them anything of value. Not because they are uniquely evil, but because this is the nature of human self-interest operating without the constraint of genuine character. The powerful man does not rage against this reality. He architects around it. He rebuilds his relationships, his alliances, his inner circle with an entirely different selection criterion, not who is pleasant, not who is enthusiastic, not who appears loyal when loyalty is free, but who has demonstrated that they will absorb a cost in order to remain aligned with you. That list, after a genuine collapse, is always shorter than expected, and that brevity is not a tragedy. It is a clarification of extraordinary value. He discovers that most of what he called strategy was actually improvisation dressed in confident language. He was reacting to circumstances and calling it vision. He was making decisions based on incomplete information and calling it judgment. He was following the momentum of early success and calling it skill. And when the momentum reversed, when the circumstances shifted against him, when the incomplete information revealed its gaps, the strategy dissolved because it had never been strategy at all. It had been fortune-wearing strategy's clothing. This discovery is perhaps the most important of all, because it points directly to what genuine reconstruction requires. Not more effort in the same direction, not more speed, more aggression, more hustle applied to the same fundamentally reactive approach, but the development of actual strategic thinking, the slow, disciplined cultivation of the ability to see further than the immediate moment, to anticipate rather than simply react, to construct sequences of moves rather than responding to whatever the situation demands in the present. Machiavelli described this as the difference between the prince who builds his power on the favour of the people and the prince who builds his power on fortresses of his own construction. The first is always vulnerable, because what the people give, the people can withdraw. The second has something that cannot be taken, because he built it himself, with his own understanding, his own discipline, his own carefully accumulated capability. This is the target. This is what the period of stillness and honest recalibration is building toward. Because when the powerful man finally moves again, and he will move, with a patience that looks like defeat to everyone watching, and feels like controlled detonation to him, he moves differently. He moves with the precision of someone who has eliminated the assumptions that made him vulnerable. He moves with the selectivity of someone who has clarified exactly which relationships deserve his investment and which ones were always transactional, disguised as genuine. He moves with the strategic depth of someone who has stopped confusing activity with progress and learned to measure movement by outcomes rather than effort. And the world, which had written him off, which had watched his collapse with a mixture of pity and quiet satisfaction that other people's failures tend to produce, encounters something it did not expect. Not the man it remembered, not the restored version of what existed before. Something new. Something that has been forged rather than simply repaired. Something that carries in its very construction the lessons of the collapse that produced it. There is a particular quality that every powerful person who has rebuilt from total loss carries with them that is almost impossible to manufacture any other way. It is not confidence exactly, though it resembles confidence from a distance. It is not arrogance, though lesser men sometimes mistake it for that. It is the specific, unmistakable quality of a person who has already survived the thing they used to fear most, who has stood in the ruins of everything they built, looked at the emptiness, and discovered that they did not dissolve, that beneath the titles and the money and the relationships and the reputation there was something that the collapse could not reach. And having discovered that, they are free in a way that people who have never truly lost anything simply cannot access. Machiavelli understood this freedom. He wrote from his farm in exile, stripped of everything, and produced work of extraordinary clarity and force precisely because he no longer had anything to protect. The man who has nothing to lose and has made peace with that fact is the most dangerous kind of man in any room he enters, not because he is reckless, but because he is unconstrained by the fear that paralyzes everyone else. The fear of losing status, the fear of disapproval, the fear of failure. He has already failed at the highest level he had achieved. He has already absorbed the disapproval of the world. He has already lost the status. And he is still here, still thinking, still building, still moving. This is what collapse gives you that nothing else can. Not strength, in the abstract sense that motivational content sells it, but the specific, concrete, tested knowledge that you can absorb catastrophic loss and continue to function, that your identity does not live in your circumstances, that your capability does not depend on your position, that you are, at the most fundamental level, not the things you had, but the person who had them, and that person remains when the things are gone. Most men never discover this because most men never lose everything. They lose some things, and those losses are painful, but they always retain enough of the structure to maintain the identity they have built around it. The job changes, but the career continues. The relationship ends, but the social circle remains. The investment fails, but the financial foundation holds. And so they never have to answer the question that total collapse forces you to answer. Who are you when there is nothing left to point to? What remains when everything external is removed? The powerful man who is rebuilt knows the answer to that question with a certainty that cannot be shaken, because it has already been tested under the worst conditions he has experienced. And that certainty changes everything about how he operates going forward. It changes how he negotiates, because he is no longer negotiating from the hidden desperation of someone who cannot afford to walk away. It changes how he builds relationships, because he is no longer seeking validation or approval to fill an internal deficit. It changes how he makes decisions, because he is no longer protecting an image of himself that he is terrified of losing. He is simply building, clearly and deliberately, because building is what he has chosen to do. Not because he needs the outcome to define him, but because the work itself is an expression of who he has become. Machiavelli wrote that fortune is like a river that floods and destroys everything in its path when men have not taken the precaution of building embankments and dikes in calmer times. The man who has been through the flood and survived understands the river in a way that men who have only studied it from safe ground never will. He has felt its force. He knows where the current runs fastest, where the undertow hides, where the banks are deceptive. And when he builds his embankments, he builds them with that knowledge embedded in every decision. This is the third and final stage of how powerful people rebuild after losing everything, and it is the one that separates the men who rise once from the men who become genuinely difficult to destroy. They institutionalize the lessons. They do not simply learn from the collapse in the vague, inspirational sense of the word. They restructure their entire approach to power, relationships, decision-making, and risk around the specific intelligence the collapse provided. They build systems that account for the vulnerabilities the loss exposed. They cultivate capabilities that did not exist in the previous version of themselves. They create redundancies against the specific failure modes that brought them down, and they do this patiently, without announcing it, without the performative declarations of reinvention that men who are rebuilding for an audience tend to make. Real reconstruction is quiet. It is unglamorous. It happens in the hours when no one is watching, in the decisions that no one will know about for months or years, in the slow accumulation of capability and leverage and genuine alliance that does not announce itself until the moment it becomes undeniable. Because this is the other thing Machiavelli understood about power that most people miss entirely. Timing is not a detail. Timing is architecture. The man who moves too soon reveals himself before he is ready and is crushed by people who are still stronger and more established than he is. The man who waits until the moment of genuine readiness and moves with precision and decisiveness in that moment is the man who appears to rise suddenly, who appears to come from nowhere, who appears to have been lucky. He was not lucky. He was patient. He was strategic. He was building in the dark for as long as it took, and when the moment arrived, everything he had built in silence became visible all at once. This is why the collapse, as devastating as it feels while you are inside it, contains within it the possibility of something that ordinary success, gradual and comfortable and uninterrupted, almost never produces. Ordinary success builds capability incrementally, but it also builds comfort incrementally. It builds confidence, but it also builds assumptions. It builds power, but it builds attachments to that power and the identity constructed around it. And those attachments become liabilities. They become the things that make a man cautious when he should be bold, defensive when he should be adaptive, rigid when the situation demands fluidity. Collapse burns all of that away. Not gently, not kindly, with complete indifference to your preferences or your timeline or your pain. It removes everything that was conditional and leaves you with only what was real. And what is real, the actual capability, the genuine character, the true understanding of yourself and the world, that is the foundation that cannot be taken. That is what the powerful man builds on when he rebuilds. Not borrowed status, not inherited reputation, not the goodwill of people who were comfortable when things were easy. The bedrock of his own, tested, verified, collapse, surviving self. Machiavelli ended his period of exile and loss by writing letters to the Medici, the very family that had destroyed his career, offering his knowledge and his counsel. Not from desperation, not from humiliation, but from the cold strategic recognition that the path back to influence ran through reality as it existed, not through reality as he wished it to be. He had no sentimentality about it. He had no illusions about the nature of the men he was writing to. He simply saw the board clearly and made the move that the board required. That is the final lesson. Powerful people who rebuild after losing everything do not require the world to be fair before they engage with it. They do not require their enemies to be punished before they move forward. They do not require circumstances to become comfortable before they are willing to act. They take the world as it is, as Machiavelli took it, with open eyes and cold clarity and the deep, unshakable patience of someone who has already been through the worst and knows with absolute certainty that they are still here, still capable, still building. And that is not something the world gave them. That is something the collapse made them prove to themselves, which means it belongs to them completely. And no one, no circumstance, no reversal of fortune, no betrayal, no disaster can ever take it away again.